is going to be one of our slides we're going to go over for this week, the week of April 6th through the 10th. So let's dive into this one right now. This one's kind of a fun one. This one is called The Portuguese. Come on. Okay, so this one's called The Portuguese. It's by the artist named George Barak. This is done in 1911, oil on canvas. Canvas. What I want you to do for the movement is I want you to be very specific for this movement because it's going to be important to distinguish between two types of cubisms. Okay, so this particular movement, you can classify it under as cubism. However, I want you to specifically put this is during the second phase of cubism. It's called high analytical cubism. We've already seen analytical cubism. That was from yesterday, the Demoiselles de Avignon by Picasso with the women, the Avignon women. So this one is kind of moving a little bit further in time, shifting. Again, we're looking at the date of 1911. So this is classified, again, put it under as cubism. Specifically, this is high analytical cubism. Okay, so I just want to point that out, and we'll be able to see some differences between the two as we get into discussing this a little bit further. A couple things I just wanted you to kind of point out. You do see a little bit of stenciling, and this is going to actually come into play for a little bit about his background. But if you want to, you can even draw over this so you can kind of really distinguish between what this says. You see the letter D, and then you see the letters B, A, L. This was actually part of a fragment of a poster on which it was an advertisement, and it was in regards to a grand ball, which is a big dance. And so this is stenciled on, and numbers are emphasized, or trying to again emphasize the flatness of this canvas. So we're going to talk a lot about how this is showing some dimension. However, it's supposed to be all completely flat, two dimension. So we'll get into talking about that in just a second. Just to know a little bit about the background of where the Portuguese comes from, and maybe as you start to hear this discussion, you'll be able to, when you're looking at this painting, be able to see some distinctive features. So it's said that Barak, the artist, he was inspired to do this work by a Portuguese musician. Okay, so he saw perform in a bar in Marseille. So I think down below, later on we'll talk about it, but below there should be some sort of a distinction of a guitar. If you could kind of start to kind of look at it and break it apart, we'll start to kind of see some of these features play. So the only other thing to mention before we get into any further, it becomes impossible to find recognizable subject matter, and it can cause great frustration. So um, if you persist in trying to read the title, you'll be able to recognize little recognizable fragments. So take the title, The Portuguese, and then again, me telling you that this is supposed to be resembling like a musician. And you should even be able to kind of distinguish somewhat of a guitar down below. Let that kind of just guide you as you start to examine this one. So the other artist that we need to discuss, and he's actually going to be another both these artists are going to be people that we talk about in our next slide as well. Is Picasso and Baroque. And what we need to really pay attention to at this time, again, paying attention, it's the early 1900s, is they were working closely together. And in 1908, soon after Baroque saw Picasso's De Moiselles, the Abnegone woman. Barak was fascinated by the analytical abstraction Picasso used in the De Moiselles. So Picasso had gone to even Cézanne's exhibit, and if you maybe remember Cézanne, he is the one that did the Mount St. Victory, the mountain with the patches of blocks. And he went to his exhibit, and after seeing it he began to simplify the geometry of his forms, faceting the surface structure and dissolving the forms into multiple viewpoints. So for this, it's actually depicting multiple viewpoints, but again, the concept of it being completely 2D flat is what we just need to keep in the back of our minds. So the fragmentation of forms also reflects the impact. We're getting a little sciencey here with Einstein's theory of relativity, published in 1905. So, a quote that was mentioned is Cubist rejection of accepted artist practice illustrates the public's dwindling faith in a safe, concrete Newton world in the face of physics of Einstein and others. So, again, we're kind of seeing a little bit of just a rebel against like the academia art at that time. Again, we're pulling away from that 19th century of the fine arts of nature, and we're really getting into just studying shapes, okay? The elements of art, shapes, lines, forms, colors, okay? Textures. That's what we're really going to be focusing on at this particular time. So, just to add to your notes, and I really would like for you to just make sure you have this down, is the first phase of Cubism is from 1908 to 1911, and it's called the analytical Cubism. So that's what you can classify for Picasso. And there's a three-step process that Picasso and Baroque used, and I'd like for you to add this to your notes as well. Okay, I promise it's not too long. The first one is analyze. Okay, so the first phase of this cubism, this analytical cubism, is going to be analyze. And it's analyzing an object by looking at it from every possible angle. Okay, that's number one. Number two, and I want you to even underline analyze. Number two is going to be simplify and fragment the object into flat, angular wedges or facets. Okay, so simplify and fragment, you can underline that, the object into flat, angular wedges or facets. So basically, they're at this time, they're looking at an object, they're looking at it multiple angles, and they're really paying attention to flat, angular wedges or facets that they can go ahead and just leave completely flat. Okay. And then number three, I want you to put as recombine. With all those particular aspects, um, those faceted fragments are now arranged in a new arrangement that shows multiple vantage points simultaneously. And I think you could clearly see that with the um, list de Mausolées Abnagon. Let's see if I can just show that to you real quick. Again, that multiple vantage point is what we really were focusing yesterday on, and really breaking up this painting into shapes and looking at it from various viewpoints. Okay, so now that's just to define that a little bit. Let me just go back. Okay. So again, we're talking about for number three, it's recombine those faceted fragments into new arrangements that show multiple vantage points simultaneously. In order to keep the focus on form, they reduce the distraction of color to a monochromatic palette of browns, grays, and blacks. So that would be something good to put for elements of art for color for this particular one, is that we're seeing a type of color scheme. It's called monochromatic. And if you're not familiar with that, it's just basically one color and you're seeing the tints and shades of that. Now, however, you could kind of classify this one as seeing multiple tints and shades of a few different colors, but it's pretty much just kind of strictly sticking, almost if you even want to classify it as like neutral colors. You see browns, grays, and blacks, and you see lights, you see the tints, and you see the shades of that. Okay, so monochrome palette for this one. Okay. The Cubist painters also rejected inherited concept of art that showed copy of nature, or they showed adopt, or they, excuse me, or that they should adopt the traditional techniques of perspective, modeling, and foreshortening. Okay, so they've completely rejected that. We're not seeing those techniques being used anymore. Again, we're not in the fine art academia anymore. So they really wanted to instead emphasize the two-dimensionality of the canvas. Okay, so they reduced and fractured objects into geometric forms Okay, so we're seeing just a bunch of shapes. Okay, we do see a little bit of some like organic, somewhat of organic shapes if you even want to kind of classify, but it's mostly angularity where we just see a bunch of straight lines. We do see again a little bit of some curves going on, but mostly these are just like in geometry. Okay, so they've reduced the fractured objects into geometric forms and then realign these within a shallow relief-like space. They also use multiple or contrasting viewpoints. So again, we're seeing those multiple viewpoints being distinguished here. Okay. All right, so please add this part to your notes. During the high analytical cubism, okay, so this time period is being classified under 1910 to 1912. So this being 1911, this is right in the middle. Both Picasso and Baroque were continuing on with their abstract works during this period and would frequently combine representation, motifs, and letters. Okay, so that's where we're seeing when I described it earlier in the beginning where we saw the word. This is partially where you could see it's cut off, but it says grand ball. You can even make out a couple numbers down here. So this is going to be a little bit more of a different trend, going a little bit more further by adding these such representational motifs and letters. Okay, so that's for high analytical cubism. Barak had a background, just so that you can add for context for Barak, he had a background as a commercial painter where he used stenciling of letters and words. So again, that's where we're seeing that kind of concept come into play. Their favorite motifs were still lifes with musical instruments, bottles, pictures, glasses, newspapers, playing cards, and the human face and figure. Okay, just to wrap this one up, guys. So Picasso and Barak were so closely together during this period that they went their they wanted their works to be indistinguishable, and they didn't sign their works, but art experts can tell them apart. Um, and then this is just the last little part, the composition for continuing on. At the upper center, we see forms that vaguely look like parts of a face, and near the bottom, we can make out what looks like part of a guitar. It's important to remember that as hard as it is to recognize objects, these are not non-objective like most Kandinsky and Mondrian, because the starting point is actual objects that are then abstracted. So the fact that we can actually start to understand that some of these are actual objects is what is going to classify this as not a non-objective piece. Okay, and again, we'll look at Kandinsky and Mondrian, um, the composition of red, blue, and yellow, if you haven't seen that video yet, as being more in the non-objective category. So the non-objective artists don't start with recognizable objects. They start with colors, lines, shapes, but no objects. Okay? So that's to wrap up for the Portuguese. Okay? Over and out, Miss Howard.